Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. Analytics topics covered conversationally and sometimes with explicit language.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 300. This is Analytics Power Hour. Okay, sorry. That's just a dumb joke on the movie. Okay, every time you turn around, I think you're hearing about the semantic layer. We even did a show on the topic recently. It's what AI needs to be successful. Well, that's at least what we keep hearing from the vendors. And well, honestly, that was right around the time we ran across an article that grabbed our attention. What if we didn't need semantic layers? Then we read an article by OpenAI. They published about how they're using AI to analyze data and took a closer look at a couple of vendor websites. We started seeing that context for AI isn't only a semantic layer thing. And well, we wanted to talk about that. So let me introduce my co-hosts. Mo Kiss of Canva. How you going?
I'm going great. Thanks for asking, Michael.
I see you're down a remote on the wall there. So
jeez.
No, I'm just kidding.
I love when we give a visual in-joke that no one else can follow.
For an audio podcast. It's okay. We'll make a clip out of it. Anyways, Julie Hoyer of Further, welcome. Glad to see you.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Awesome. And Go Browns. And Michael Helbling. So naturally, we reached out to the author of one of those articles, and I'm excited that he is our guest. Jacob Matson is a developer advocate at MotherDuck, the cloud data warehouse built for answers. He has also held senior data and accounting roles at firms like Semantic, Funko, and Verimatrix. And today he is our guest. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Hey, Michael and Julie and Mo. It's great to be here. I'm super pumped.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you. So I think, Jacob, maybe to kick off the conversation, I think it would be great for us to understand a little bit more, both about your background and exposure to this and sort of what started formulating for you that led to you kind of digging in and doing research in this area around sort of semantic layer or not, or other alternatives to semantic layers.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I guess I'll start with like a little bit of biography that got us here. I'll try not to, be too self-indulgent. So when I graduated from college, I worked in accounting, in public accounting. I sat for the exams, did all that stuff and worked in public accounting, and then at a company called Verimatrix. It was called out there. Doing all of the normal accounting things, right? Climbing the ladder in a very specific kind of governed way, working for people with titles like controller or CFO, and eventually, taking some of those on myself. I think one of the things that we always talked about was like, especially on the financial side, was like, how do we know what numbers are right for, this definition of this thing, right? And at the time, the tools we had were much, much worse than we have now. I remember it being a big deal when we got the Excel that could handle 1 million rows and not just 65,000 rows. That's what I think it was Excel 2003, maybe, which of course, actually what all it did was train everyone to just have a horrible experience in Excel all the time and just be totally fine with it. It's just too much information. It can't handle it. And then we all dealt with saving issues and, crashing and all these things all the time.
Yeah. Don't calculate your metrics until you're really ready.
Yeah, exactly. Turn that automatic calculation off.
That's right.
Yeah. Step one. Yeah. Step 2, save it as a binary format Excel file. So did all those things, and had the pleasure of working on things like, MDX and DAX along the way, which are both of kind of like the modeling languages that are built into the Microsoft stack. And kind of along the way through that journey, really kind of found my way towards using SQL for a lot of the work I was doing. And that just kind of naturally came out of the data that I had was too big for Excel, and it was too complicated. And there was lots of really, I was just driven 100% on just the business need for solving these problems. And I needed to get more robust tooling. And we had SQL Server, and it had more, it was running on a server that had more compute than my laptop and all these things. And so it was very natural to kind of progress up there. And, I've done lots of fun things kind of in that space. I kind of like to joke that I always worked in data from the beginning of my career. It's just my pipelines ran once a month. Right. It was a month-end close process for those of you at home. Anyways, that's kind of how I got there. And so you do a lot of things along the way, and you see lots of errors along the way too. Some material, some not. Right. And, I worked on the IT side at a public company, and, you see lots of interesting things produced internally that never make their way into the, filing documents, for example, sent to the SEC. So I think for me, what kind of some of the genesis that led to this notion of like, do we need semantic layers anymore, was like two things. A, working in accounting for a long time and like understanding the quality that goes into those numbers, which is very high, but also not as high as you'd like, is what I would say. And then the second part of that is that like, we often, at least what I would see on the accounting side, was like we would get too precious about the exact accuracy and precision of a number instead of actually moving the business forward. Right. And so what actually happened in my career, at least, is that like it seemed like I wasn't that close to it early in my career, but like what it felt like is that like CFOs in particular completely abdicated the realm of analytics to like some other domain. Like, what we can't get accurate enough. It's not good enough for whatever reporting we're building. We're just going to let some other part of the org like handle that. In fact, I remember even seeing like job descriptions that were like director of analytics, non-finance, like type of roles. I experienced that when I was at a company growing really fast and was trying to build all of these things. And I built, our first data warehouse from very much accounting principles first. And eventually it just got to the point where we had to break that apart because it was just, we didn't have the right primitives to answer the questions in a way that we were comfortable with. And we tried all the things and it was just really hard to manage and to update. So a little bit of this idea is me manifesting, like, what if I just took away all the pain that I experienced when I was like building these analytics cubes back in the day? Like, what if we could just like ask AI those questions and it would like reformulate those on the fly? And so that was kind of like what led me to exploring the idea and then beginning to do like research around it.
Can you tell me a little bit about the tension that you kind of touched on, but we didn't go deep? The tension. So, I mean, we talked about this with Cindy a little while back about semantic layers, and just like it's been sold at the moment as like the holy grail, as every new, not actually new idea in analytics is, that it will solve all of our problems. But that core tension that you touched on how hard it is to maintain the like inflexibility perhaps that then makes you not able to answer your business questions. Like, what were some of your lived experiences?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I mean, I think like the first one was, I was working on an ERP system and we were like, hey, we want to implement like better reporting and analytics on it. We're going to buy this software package that will just like automatically build out all the OLAP cubes for us. And then we can like tie them into our BI tool. I think this was even like pre-Tableau maybe. And well, Tableau existed, but it didn't exist for the company I worked at, I think. That's what I would say. It was certainly not something I was tracking at the time. We bought the software and then I was like, okay, now let's like implement it. And it was like, it had to fit in a very narrow box for us to actually take advantage of it. And that was a pattern I saw repeated a lot kind of in the ERP space too, which was like, hey, just like, make your business fit into this template of how we run our systems. And then you get all of these awesome synergies or whatever, right? Like now you don't need people to do your buying. You just like run this report and it tells you what to buy. And so what I kind of came to believe, I think like I definitely wanted to say, all right, let's just like apply this system. Let's apply these SAP primitives that are, very old and well tested. Let's just apply this like blindly to our business. Like, why are we overcomplicating it? Like, our business is not this hard. But then what I kind of discovered is that the interesting parts of your business are really hard to define in someone else's model, right? They end up being, unless you're like a pure commodities trader, like the magic happens kind of in the margins. And so like defining those systematically is super hard. I really struggled with that. And so like when I kind of realized that that was the mental model that I was bringing to these problems, I started being like, hang on, how do I design this ERP system that we're working on that was my accountability? How do I make it so that like we can do the thing that we need to do, to make the system work, but also we allow kind of space in the way that we interact with this so that like the magic of the company, what differentiates the organization, can still happen too. And so like once I started thinking about it that way, that really kind of unlocked for me kind of a way for us to move forward. And it was much less difficult to kind of get people on board, because it wasn't like, hey, we're going to totally change your job and make it so that like it just fits into this box. It was more like, okay, how do we meet in the middle? And so, I think there's a little bit of a paradox in that, right? Which is like the paradox is that you need some level of conformity across the organization for like everyone to be able to communicate well. But also, if you have too much conformity, you have a commodity, and you need space for your to have some sort of differentiation. And so I think like that's kind of the perspective I brought there. I think figuring out which constraints, I kind of like think about it sometimes like this game Jenga. I don't know if you all played that, but you have like a stack of
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So you have like this stack of blocks, right? Some of them you touch them and you're like, okay, I can't pull that one out. That one has to stay there.
It's load bearing.
But like you only figure that out like kind of existentially, right? Like you don't. So like for me, I spent a lot of time just like trying stuff. I'm like, okay, you know what? That didn't work. The CFO just got really mad at me. Like, we won't do that. But like, let's try this other path. And I think a lot of it just became like, and then at the end you have this beautiful tower, right? Hopefully you don't knock it over, but you have this beautiful tower, and that tower is unique shape that like hopefully fits what actually represents what the business is. And so that's kind of how I think about it.
Hey, Tim, have you ever opened GTM preview mode and immediately thought, well, there goes my afternoon?
Absolutely. Nothing says fun like hunting through a giant pile of tags trying to figure out which one broke.
Yeah, that's why Stape built Stape GTM Helper, a free Chrome extension for debugging Google Tag Manager.
And free means actually, free. No sign up, no subscription. Just install it from the Chrome Web Store and start debugging.
Yeah, and it works with both web and server-side GTM. It helps you focus on what matters by filtering down to the specific tags you're testing.
Your tags from Google, Meta, and Microsoft are color-coded so they're easy to spot. And it makes JSON payloads readable instead of whatever they normally are.
Yeah, and for server-side GTM, it gives you better visibility into consent status, and it can help with Shopify checkout debugging too.
There's even a website tracking health scanner that gives you a web and server-side tracking report with actionable fixes.
The Stape GTM Helper is a must-have for anyone deploying or managing tags in GTM. Search for Stape GTM Helper in the Chrome Web Store, or use the link in the show notes page on our site. It's free, installs fast, and might just save your afternoon.
Michael, where does your best AI analysis live right now?
Oh, I've got this Claude conversation called GA4 Help for this meeting I've got coming up. It's buried between a lunch recommendation and me asking it to explain regex to me like I'm a fifth grader.
Exactly. That's the problem. Your AI work gets trapped in one chat with one person in one thread.
Ah, yes, the modern knowledge base. I swear Claude told me this somewhere.
And that's why Ask Why built Prism with memory and shared context across users.
So the useful stuff doesn't vanish into my private little AI cave?
Exactly. It's out of the cave into the sun. Prism keeps the context, your metric definitions, source of truth tables, business rules, prior analyses, and makes it usable across the entire team.
I like this. So if I teach it that active user means 3 sessions in 30 days, Julie doesn't have to teach it again tomorrow.
Exactly. And if Val runs a GA4 cohort analysis, that knowledge can live in Prism, organized and traceable, not locked inside her chat history like a tiny little analytics hostage.
I am starting to like this. Team memory, not ask Michael because he remembers the cursed dashboard lore.
Plus, with Claude Cowork and Prism, your analysis becomes shareable, auditable, and ready to build on.
I like this. So the AI becomes company knowledge, not just some vibes I had with a chatbot at 11:42 p.m.
That's right, because that's way after my bedtime. So go to ask-y.ai and join the waitlist.
And you can use the code APH, and it'll take you to the top of the list. That's ask-y.ai, code APH. Because your team's brain should not be trapped in one person's chat tab.
Exactly.
Everyone can see my face, obviously not our lovely listeners, but everyone on the podcast. I love an analogy. My company loves an analogy. And I feel like this Jenga one I'm going to take it way too far. Because at some point you do knock it down. Like that's the reality of when we build data architecture and systems, like at some point you do end up rebuilding. But I think the exact tension that I feel right now, and I keep banging on about like 80 to 90%, we do need standardization. We do need some like conformity, because otherwise if one person over here calculates it this way and one person does, like we can't ever have a mature conversation. But I think the really challenging part is how we get that that 10 to 15 or 20% that should be bespoke or like is actually a unique situation. And I'm thinking about those are the Jenga blocks that you push through and you can move.
Yeah, that's right.
But you just have such a wealth of experience here. Like, it sounds like for you, a bit of that was trial and error. If I want to learn from all your trialing and erroring, how do you figure out what the standardization bit is and where the flexibility needs to be?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think some of it is like being able to zoom out and kind of like understand what the engine is of the company. Like, how does it function? Like, what's differentiating it about your competitors? But then like also like how does that build the feedback loop that, ultimately, increases the cash on the balance sheet, hopefully. Right. So like, I always felt like that was an advantage for me as someone coming from an accounting background where I'm just like, it's very easy for me to visualize, okay, if this business is great at X, they will increase their cash flow. Right. And so I think a little bit is like developing good intuition around that. And I'm very thankful to like have grown up in, working for CFOs who were very excellent mentors as it related to that. But like, I think the second part of that is you always have to, your model for reality is imperfect, right? And so you need to kind of be able to test that model in a way that is sort of safe. And what I mean by that is like, you don't get fired if you're wrong. You might get reprimanded. That's okay.
That's the threshold.
Like, I think, yeah, exactly. Like you can take some risk, right? But you want it to be the right risk. And so I think a lot of the trial and error part was like, just, how do we calculates, take some risk here that is not like too drastic, but is opinionated in a way that like if we're correct, we win more.
Do you have an example of like what that risk is? Like, I don't know why I'm having a hard time conceptualizing like the risky metric. Like Mo, in the previous episode that we talked about semantic layers, I think you had thrown out the example of like monthly average users when we were talking about semantic layers. Like, is that a risky metric? Is that a metric that moves the business forward? Like, can we like talk through a metric like that for a business like Canva? Like, I think monthly active users is one that I wouldn't take a risk on. And that's because it's one of our company foundational goals. So like we have long historical reporting, but actually like where it does get complicated, right? And I'm going to give you a specific example is like, we often will look at monthly active users by different products. And sometimes different people have different interpretations of like what that product monthly active user is. And that's why there's like so much devil in the detail, right? Like it's such a gray zone because someone might be like, oh, anyone that like used any kind of like video or social media. And some people might be like, well, it's only video if you did X, Y, and Z, like you were in our video editor and you used advanced video features. And that's why it's like, it's just messy. Our jobs are messy.
Totally agree. When I think about risk, I guess like I would put it in a slightly different, I would not necessarily frame it as like analytics first, but I would just say that like I left a job and then like a month later, someone on the team who was still there sent me a message and was like, man, it has been rough since you've been gone. And I was like, why? And I'm like, everyone knows all the things. There was nothing interesting happening. He's like, well, no one's making any decisions. And I was just like, oh yeah, okay, I could see that. And so I think like some of it, like when I talk about risk, I just honestly am just like, make a decision, right? Like be opinionated on what it means to have a monthly active user by product X, Y, and Z. not Z, sorry. And like, maybe that there's lots of interesting things that happen when you start breaking those things apart, right? And, one thing that I think I was well trained on because I was in accounting is you get really good at like delivering bad news, and so you're always one of the first objectives in accounting is like, you want this to be true. You want it to be the numbers you're showing are a reflection of reality as you understand it, right? In a way that is defensible. And like sometimes when you're dealing with metrics, especially with product teams, like, they want to show that their thing is working. Right. And like what you're, it's a tension, right, between the domain team and like a central team, which is, okay, like what is truth to to the company and like what moves the business forward. And I would almost always say that like we want to be measuring things in a way that when they're tested against reality, they're proven to be right. right? And so when people are bringing agendas into things like, hey, like I want to define something in a way that says, I get more monthly active users. Well, if that's not moving the company forward, that metric when it's tested is going to fail, right? And so how do we do that? How do we test them more closely against reality is a really interesting question. And the way we do that is by like, potentially taking bets and like making decisions on them, right?
I'm taking us completely down off topic as per usual. I just want to push on this a little bit because I do see this happen. And I'm curious if your experience in accounting has perhaps given you confidence or like you've built the confidence to sometimes have an opinionated decision. Whereas I feel like often in data land, sometimes there is this like desire to debate every which way something can be cut and like maybe like make a proposal, but like not often enough be like, you know what, I'm going to have an opinion here of like, we're going to calculate it this way. Let's do this. Let's move the business forward. Like, do you think sometimes like that, is that your accounting background? Do you think that helps you have that perspective because you're more willing to have a position knowing it's the best of where you can get to? Or do you think that's like you personally? Like, what do you think's driven that willingness to take a gamble and have an opinion?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of self-selection. Like part of why I liked accounting was because it let me do things like that or like gave me a framework to reason about those things. Right. I think I'm probably a little contrarian by nature. And so, when I see people getting like too precious about metrics, I'm definitely just like, let's make a decision. Let's figure it out and we will test it. And if it's wrong, we can fix it. Right. One of the things that's great about, analytics in general compared to, I don't know, financial numbers that you're publishing to your board or whatever is that you have a lot more degrees of freedom in terms of what it looks like to go back and make something better. One of the biggest challenges, right, in analytics is like, hey, that number got put into, our regulatory filings. So like, that's how we do that now. Yep. Like you cannot change that anymore. So like, obviously, like, you don't want to take, you could, I don't know if this happened to me specifically, but I'm sure, well, actually, yes, it has, where we made up some way to bin some set of data. And then suddenly it was in, annual reports. And now it's like, okay, now we're always presenting that. And if I'd known, I think from experience would have been like, hey, let's be a little more precious about this. And I think like, it's definitely a tough balance, but we don't need to be perfect, right? As long as we kind of know, and it's justifiable and we can defend it, I think we can go pretty far. But like, there's risk, right? There's risk that you could be wrong.
Do you feel like of all the context in a business, what percentage of it that people use day to day, like when creating metrics, defining metrics, like doing their analysis, making decisions, what percentage of it is actually captured in a formal, like static semantic layer for like broad knowledge compared to they're just doing it, like adding in their own context and their own SQL queries and their own, the way they're pulling the data? I
mean, now that I work in marketing, it's a lot less than it was when I worked in finance. So it's contextual, I think.
There are no generally accepted analytics principles, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I feel like it's a small percentage, smaller than maybe people want it to be. And do you feel like people are always fighting to like make it as close to 100 as possible? Or
I think like the tension is that like everyone wants the risk to be low. Like, hey, if I'm going to use data to make this decision, well, then it better be right. The data better be right. And therefore, I'm not going to use the data because I don't want to take accountability for someone else, something produced by someone else. I want to take my own accountability. I think that's a core, definitely a challenge. Do I see it moving towards 100%? I mean, I think like if you're moving toward 100%, like you're just automating the entire function, right? I mean, I guess that's like Google AdWords bidding, right? Like, okay, the whole thing's automated. The price is the price. In some ways, that's like the fully actualized form of analytics, right? Like auction pricing. Do I think that's the right way to do it? Like, I don't think, most jobs are not that straightforward. I think that it's probably a smaller percentage than most analytics people would want it to be, and probably, roughly around the right number for where things are today.
All right. I want to start to pivot into what we actually came to talk about, which was,
sure,
let's say you've been struggling with the semantic layer and you're running into all the problems that semantic layers kind of introduce. They're inflexible not easy to pull together, don't work well across different departments and teams. Like there's lots of reasons why a semantic layer is a challenge, and lots of people spend a lot of time on it. But like, what are the alternatives? What are people doing to lower their dependency on the so-called semantic layer that is sort of like the favorite of the AI world right now in data?
I mean, I think like, ultimately what we're seeing a lot of right now is that everything is kind of going into the notion of like skills, right? Which is just markdown on your laptop or in a GitHub repo or somewhere. And I think people are capturing a lot of context that way, that they are ultimately using either personally or sharing inside their company. I think there's a lot of new surface area here for products. I know, like, for example, inside of Claude, they have this notion called projects, and projects let you kind of put markdown in there and then link it to other things. And then whenever you ask a question, you can select a project and then you bring context along, with it. So I think we're seeing that. I think we're definitely seeing like vendors coming along in the space. We're seeing a lot of like, we're also seeing like the perspective from the labs, right? The labs who have unlimited tokens are just like, oh yeah, we just like, use AI to do everything. Like we're just like, maximizing our token spend to solve these problems. I think the one that I saw that was killing me was like, OpenAI has like a analytics agent, and they basically say, all right, well, we're just going to ask every question twice. So basically we'll ask, the user will ask, and then we're going to reformulate it and then have our background agent just see if it gets the same answer. And if they're too far apart, we're going to escalate it. And I think like, certainly that's one approach. I can't imagine it's cost effective for anyone at reasonable scale who's not a lab at the moment. We're seeing lots of ways that people do it. I mean, from what we have been working on, at MotherDuck, what we've started to do is just put context in a database, because of course we're a database vendor. So like put it in database, or AI is really good at writing SQL. It's really good at retrieving the right thing. And so when you do that, then you can start, treating it in a more structured way, right? Whether that's, more of like a graph that has like nodes and edges that you can use to like navigate across, or if it's just like, straight up comments on columns or whatever, which is a, old part of the SQL spec.
I am very much feeling the semantic world bubbling at the moment, and the pressure of it, and the perception that it's going to solve a lot of our problems, or the perception that it's required to do AI and data well. I think one of the points that you made that really resonated with me in the article was about semantic layers being static and how challenging that is. But I think the real thing that's keeping me up at night, right, is if we don't go down that semantic layer path, it's the validation, right? Which you just touched on, right? So the bit that's challenging that I see pop up constantly is if we don't have somewhere for people to self-validate. I find that's a hard thing that I want to solve for, because I don't want my job to be to QA other people's shitty outputs and AI hallucinations with data, which it feels like I spend some time doing now. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, at the moment, I feel like it's binary, that you either have some type of semantic layer thing where people can validate, or you go down the evaluation framework. Am I totally off here? Is it one of those binary options, or is there just a range of options and I haven't thought deeply enough about it yet?
I mean, I think the first question is about the interface, right? That you let users interact with, right? If they're interacting with a spreadsheet, there's a different set of constraints than if they're interacting with a BI tool, than if they're interfacing with a chat app, right? There's more engineering freedom, I think, on obviously a chat application, which is what, people have proven to love, just asking questions to a chatbot, than there is on a BI tool. I think that one of the biggest challenges on using, even the best BI tool in the world at this moment is that it's very difficult to interface with something else that someone else built. I think one of the things that I've really found kind of when using AI generally is that the closer the framework you're using to answer questions is a snap fit to your own brain, the easier it is to use it and use it well. When you're using someone else's model, even a really well-defined model by a really good engineer or a really good BI analyst or whatever, it's that's their model. That's not your model. That's not necessarily how you're thinking about the problem space. And the biggest challenge that LLMs solve is they're really good at translating between languages, right? And that really means they're really good at, for me as let's say someone working in marketing, to ask a question and then have the LLM reframe it to be like, oh, I see what this really means is, it means this, and that translates to this language in your current model or whatever. And so I know I'm not really kind of answering your question. I don't know. I think there is a spectrum. I don't know if we know if I think the products are not super mature as outside of the semantic layer, because the semantic layer buyer, I think traditionally has been very risk averse. That's why the reason you buy a semantic layer in the first place is because some number got somewhere and was wrong and legal's pissed. That's how you buy a semantic layer. I'm being maybe a little too cynical, but only maybe. So I think figuring out how to, how do we, again, I keep saying this word risk, but it all comes down to how much risk do you accept? And that determines the spectrum of tools that you can implement, right? If you can take on a lot of risk, like in marketing analytics, you can probably take on more risk than you can in financial analytics. That's just true, right? The cost of being wrong is way lower in marketing than it is in finance. That's just true. That's a physics problem. So I think you may not have the same solution across the entire company. It just depends, horses for courses, as they say, I suppose.
Just to be clear, I will keep asking Jacob 50,000 questions. I'm trying to make space for other people by not speaking.
That's okay. And we edit out dead air, so don't worry about that.
That's fine.
I wanted to ask, actually, Jacob, if you could talk about your proposed solution in your article that you talked about, using AI, because everybody's obsessed with having a semantic layer to help with AI, but you kind of flipped it and said also AI could help with the semantic layer problem.
So when I wrote the original article, what I was really thinking about at the time was the notion of skills and using skills kind of locally on your machine to kind of codify the way to go here. I think I've gotten a little more nuanced recently, but also I think that we've seen a lot of maturity and development, especially in the Anthropic ecosystem with projects inside of Claude, for example. I think it's a very natural way to think about it is how do I make it easier to maintain or actually create and maintain? And skills are incredibly, incredibly easy to create and maintain. Maybe too easy, right? They may not be the right abstraction. But certainly I think skills is the way that I thought about it, or, at the time. And then I just, and I've been doing kind of evals in that front against, benchmarking data sets. And, we can debate the efficacy of benchmarks versus, real life data and all these things. But I think what we do know is true is that if we can find the right context, we can very reliably return the right answer. And so I think where my thinking has gone recently is how do we make our data easy to search? Right, which is a different way than maybe we've designed it before as a Kimball model, which is how do we make it easy to retrieve? There's a whole bunch of really good research that those guys all wrote around how to make a data warehouse and how to make it work and easy to retrieve. And those were written in the constraints of the time, right? Which I think probably the original Kimball book is probably going on 25 or 30 years now. We have better technology now, and maybe we can revisit some of those assumptions. And so I think my current kind of position on this stuff is that we really have a search problem. And if we can find a way to make our metrics searchable, then the way that we define it may be less important. It might be a semantic layer that's in YAML. It might be something that's more well-defined than that. It might be, something more programmatic than even YAML that is kind of like a SQL alternative. But what I have also found is that LLMs in particular are so good at writing SQL and understanding it that adding another language that is new and bespoke is really hard to get good results out of, compared to just using the trusted good old thing that is very verbose and has weird syntax and has a whole bunch of downsides, but also there's 50 years of training data in the training set, right? So if we can figure out how to say, how do we make it search to find the right thing and then write the right SQL, we can get really good results. And I think that's what I'm seeing is most promising, at this moment.
Can we separate search from the context? Because I feel like those are two very different things and we struggle with both. So search is more about how do I point it in the the right place? How do I help it find the right table or whatever it is, right? Whereas the context is more, how do I understand this table? And do you think that what you're proposing, the way you're thinking about this, solves for both equally? Or do you think perhaps, like, I feel like we probably need a different approach for each, or different thinking?
The answer is the devil's in the details, I think. So I think where I'm struggling with this question is, like, if you assume that there is a natural language interface, right? And then maybe some sort of tooling like an MCP or something that has a search tool. Well, that's, someone should solve the search tool problem, right? Which will say, hey, let me search and find this context and return it to you. And the next thing is, writing the SQL based on that understanding. I think the second part is basically solved, which is if you give good context to an agent and say, like, describe a set of tables and then ask a question, you get really good results. And, the challenge we have, of course, is that, like, they don't have good memory. And so, like, every day we have to remind them. And so how do we make it so they have good memory? And there's a whole bunch of people, I'm sure, working on that problem. I've read quite a few papers, in the space of, like, how do we make it so when we ask a question, the next time we ask it, it's faster to get the answer. Or we already know, we already have some kind of pathway built out. The metaphor I kind of think about is, like, your data is like a jungle, right? Unless you really know where the things are, it's really hard to find stuff. We can build a semantic layer, but a semantic layer is like a highway, right? It's like we are just, like, building the thing straight through the jungle. I would almost say, like, we can build it a little more progressively, which is, hey, we need, like, these little paths, right? Maybe these paths are just wide enough for a human to walk on. And maybe this one we can put gravel on, and maybe this one we can pave, and then maybe this one we can build a highway. But, like, so I kind of think, like, I think this actually goes back to the spectrum question you asked earlier. Like, there's probably a spectrum of solutions here where a certain set of questions need to be on the highway, right? Like, if one of your key metrics is monthly active users, that needs to be right all the time. And there's a highway for that, right? And so the search problem is, like, can my agent find the highway? Okay. And if it can find the highway, then you get the answer. And then, there's a bunch of, but the interesting stuff, the reality is the interesting stuff is when you start slicing and dicing by all these arbitrary dimensions. And then, like, there's no highway for that. I can't afford to build that, even in the age of AI today. And so, how do you make it easy to do a little bit of off-roading and then still get the right thing, right? And I think, like, this is where, I think I'm in particular probably well served by, like, accounting principles as I'm building this stuff out. And I'm just like, well, what if we just made this a ledger and we can just, like, walk forward and backwards through time or whatever. Now it becomes very easy to trace it back to the highway. There's a whole bunch of abstractions like that we could talk about. But I think, like, the answer is probably, and not or in the long term. I do think that there's probably some set of questions that are so important that you need to always get the right answer. And that might mean maybe a different interface. Like, hey, for our financial reporting interface, we use X. For marketing, we use Y. I don't know.
Do you think it depends on stakeholders too? Like, I'm just thinking, so for example, if you're a data person, the context is something that exists within you. Like, you have such good context. So you know how to prompt, you know how to give the right context. And I'm talking as you're, like, in the build stage and this is evolving, right? Because if we have essentially, you're kind of suggesting, like, an evolving semantic layer or knowledge-based, graph-based, at the earlier stage, right? When that context isn't fully built, what do you think the risk is for the business user to be exposed who potentially doesn't have that same context? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, you haven't built enough of the highways yet.
Yeah, such a good question. So when we we launched our MCP server in December at MotherDuck, and we had our own existing set of dashboards for the sales team. And immediately what started happening is the sales team started, like, building their own kind of dashboards using our tool, which is really interesting to see, right? We're a small company where our risk threshold is obviously higher. But what everyone was doing was, because they already had really good context for the data, because their sales team, if the data is wrong, everyone's mad. It doesn't work. It's tested against, the sales data in particular is tested against reality all the time. Right? Because you're on a call with a customer and you're like, hey, I saw you used, 10 hours of compute last week. We sell compute. And they're like, no, we didn't. You're going to be like, okay, let me go fix my dashboard. So they have, the stakes are pretty high for them, right? And for financial teams too, they're really high, right? They need to be right. They need to be speaking about the right numbers. And so for teams that have developed an intuition for what the data should be, they're actually pretty good at using LLMs, regardless of language and understanding, like being a data person first, because they have a way to test it against reality really quickly, right? They can break down a set of numbers by, like if you're a CFO or something, you could probably break down revenue by product and you would with an LLM and be like, that's right. I can tell that it's right because I've seen this before, right? You already have like the fingertip feel for the data. But if you're someone else, especially like this is the hard part for like a data analyst who's maybe disconnected from the business, is they don't have the fingertip feel. They just have like a question from someone that says, hey, build me this thing. It's really, in that case, you really have to, rely on the context of others to help build the right thing. I think like that's, so yes, I think the stakeholder does matter. I think that certain teams are more well suited to be data driven than others, just like out of the box, but like that we can definitely close the gap with like good context. Maybe not for everyone, right? If someone asks a totally off the wall question using the wrong words, like that's we don't have a crystal ball. we have vectors that we're matching at the end of the day, right?
With this like approach that you're talking about, like using AI to kind of bring up the context for somebody who doesn't have it themselves, I have two questions. One, and I think, Mo, you were kind of asking this. So it was like, how do you know when it finds context that it's choosing the right context? Because again, we've talked about people are defining and talking about the same metric differently, especially if it's not one of the highway metrics. The other part is it feels like classically the legwork, right, was on the individual trying to ask the question, make the query. They had to go around and obviously ask and get all that context. But with the new, if we put in the solution that you're talking about, where does the legwork now live in that process? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we've shifted the hard work of determining what is right for the question you're asking, of like where to grab it, how to think about it, how it's defined, and how to define the metric you're trying to query. So I'm trying to understand those two pieces.
The first thing that I always think about is like, well, how do we make it visual? If this was a video podcast, I could show you a really sweet demo, but maybe I'll just have to send it to you. I'll have to send you a video async that shows you kind of one way that it could look like. So I think like the first thing is like, how do we make it so that interacting with the context is not just like typing into a box and then, stuff happens and you get an answer. We need to make it like you need to be able to understand what that looks like. And I think for a lot of this, because I spent so much time in like the Excel salt mines, I think about it a lot like I think about Excel, which is you have, some tab somewhere that says, here's this metric, right? Here's our profit for last quarter. And there's a little button in there that shows, trace precedence. So, okay, where does that take me? Okay, that takes me upstream. And then I can keep navigating all the way back until I kind of understand how this thing comes from. And then there's another little button on there that says calculate formula, right? And it just shows me all the little parts, and it shows how they're adding and subtracting and dividing and multiplying and how it ends up with the final number. I think like we don't have those traceability pieces yet for agentic workflows or semantic layer stuff, really. I mean, we do, but only for the developer, not for the user. And so what I'm really thinking about is, the way for me to like manifest this notion of, hey, you don't need the semantic layer. It means you need to have something else. And part of it is, yes, you need the context, but you also need a way to visualize it in a way that like people can reason about and understand and like, agree with how it was calculated, right?
But you're saying visualize the lineage though, and the way it's calculated.
I think all parts of that, right? Lineage, yes, but like less about like I would love to be like, okay, this number comes all the way from this field in your CRM. I would love to be able to do that, right? Okay, or like, some sort of way to say, hey, like we were talking about monthly active users earlier, like this, here's all the detailed ways that's calculated. I think that's probably actually too hard to reason about. It's too detailed, right? We need to kind of be able to get the proper level of zoom out, right? Where we don't want to be at the 10-foot level. We don't want to be at the 40,000-foot level. We want to be at like the 10,000-foot level. And I think it probably depends on persona too. But like you need some sort of way to be able to reason about, those numbers and how they were calculated to be confident that they're correct, right? And like SQL is, of course, one way to reason about it, right? But like SQL is like verbose and kind of hard to reason about as like a non-technical person. And like even, engineers hate using it. And there's a whole good set of reasons for that. I think like the magic of Excel continues to be like demystifying how complex some of this stuff is and doing that with really clever UI interactivity. And so, how do we, what tools, what abstractions do we need to build to make that work? And I've been working on that. I think the core thing that I've been starting with is just like, how do we take something like a set of tables and like interweave context in there to show us how the tables relate to each other, right? In some ways you'd be like, hey, that looks a lot like ERD, right? It's like, here's the primary keys, here's the foreign keys, whatever, right? But we can add a richer level of that says, okay, we calculate these metrics this way, we use these joins, we use this formula. That stuff that stuff is also, a level of the graph that's always been missing when we get to ERD, right? We don't know how it's actually used. We just have a thing that says, here's how the database defines the table. What we don't have is knowledge of how the application actually uses it. And so that's, I think, the next part too. We can mine like query history. In fact, I've done a bunch of work around that. Like, how do people actually query these? How do databases or how do applications query these? How do those patterns differ when it's a human versus an application? So there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do there. I'm not trying to be like too abstract or obtuse here, but like, I truly believe that part of it is just that we have all of like the Lego blocks, but like no one has assembled it into something that is like cohesive in a way that's like, I totally get this now, right? It's very much like, even if you're like, a high ranking executive and you like get some number, there's no, like, you're trusting that your team built it right. And like, there's not a good way today. And like lineage is part of that, but like just being able to say like, all right, how do all these components fit together, and like fitting that in your brain as like, I don't know, maybe if you're the CMO, you shouldn't do that, but like, I don't know, maybe you should do that sometimes. I don't know. Hopefully that's helpful. That's kind of just how I'm thinking about it at the moment, but like make it visual is number one.
I was going to ask, how do you fight the echo chamber effect too from some of this? Sorry, when you were talking about like using AI to search for queries, like if it's just always bringing back historical data and you were to like move that into the future, how do you do that?
Okay, so let me just make sure we frame this question. So you're basically saying like, how do you not overfit the history?
Because they were figuring it out. Some of it's not right, some of it is, or it's just the bias of like what was right at that time, and how do you get the new things in? And you have people that aren't going for the context the old-fashioned way. They're relying on the tool to give them the context, but it's old context.
So I think the first thing that I'm thinking about is like, well, if you had a semantic layer, you only have the history. You don't have anything going forward because someone curated and built that for you. So now we get a new problem to solve, right? Now, if we can just forget that the semantic layer exists, or maybe we have it and it's, it's the highway, right? But we want to detect when there are changes, right? When there's drift in our metrics, right? How do we detect that? I think this is a really good question. I don't know if there's like good programmatic ways that I'm like aware of off the top of my head at the moment, but certainly like there's probably ways to do it programmatically. And I think like also some of it is like, well, if there's less humans, doing some of the work that's really easy to automate with AI, well, now what do those humans do next? I think part of it is like, yeah, maybe we need like a curator person who's like handling this context potentially, right? I think I kind of like always jokingly talk about like, hey, we need like more librarians. Like we're generating all this context all the time. And it's like, what do we do with it? It's like, I don't know, it just like lives in Slack or like Teams or our emails or, DMs on WhatsApp or whatever. And like, eventually it makes its way, into the canon of the organization. Right. But like that time is like really can be really long. How do we make that tighter is a really interesting question. I do think it's like in the other side of that is like, well, what about archival? Right. What if a metric was right and is now wrong? How do you discard it and like manage the life cycle of it? So I think like all of those pieces in my mind like kind of fit together, which is like life cycle management of this. And it's like we never even got there because we just get to like semantic layer is published, and then it's like it's such a big lift to like even get there that it's just like, okay, like I got promoted, thank you. I'm gonna go to another company and I'll do this again. This is now your problem. Like, sorry. And I'm being sort of facetious, but like these are hard. Like everyone wants to build it, no one wants to maintain it. And I think like there's probably space for companies or multiple companies in the space to build products that help us do this better. But, I don't have anything off the top of my head that's like, well, here's how you catch drift and like re-implement it. I wish I had the answer. It would be more compelling maybe.
Next time,
right?
Let me do more. That can be my next set of research. We'll see if we can do it. We are fully migrating our internal stuff. So
if we wanted certainty, Jacob, we would have just interviewed Claude, right? So this is great.
Yeah, exactly.
This is awesome. Thank you so much. Really excellent conversation. One of the things we do at the end of every show is go around the horn and share a last call, something that might be of interest to our users. Jacob, you're our guest. Do you have a last call you'd like to share?
I just read a really awesome paper that I will share a link to you to, Michael, called Skill Opt Executive Strategy for Self-Evolving Agent Skills. I saw it on Twitter this morning. It is really interesting. I'll share it and you can put it in the show notes. Definitely worth a read just to understand, what it looks like to actually apply some of this stuff about what exactly we were talking about. How do we evolve these things as the systems change?
That's awesome. I love it. Awesome. Julie, what about you? What's your last call?
Okay, my last call's a little off the wall, but it was just too timely. Okay, so Mo, this is a little bit a fun fact about me and a question to you because it has to do with Canva. Okay, fun fact. I don't like squirrels. Like I don't like them. I don't think they're cute. They creep me out.
Okay.
Yeah, they kind of scare me. Because, quick backstory. My dad said, to this little girl, if you see possums or raccoons in the daylight, they're rabid. I thought that meant squirrels. I went around for years thinking squirrels were rabid. You know how they pop around trees when you're riding your bike? They like hide on the other side. I always thought they were going to pop out and get me. I don't like squirrels. Okay. Fun fact that I don't share with lots of people. I get an email from Canva that is squirrel themed. And the CTA at the bottom of the email said, if you would like to stop getting squirrel themed content, like opt out here. And I was like, has AI personalized too far? Or like, is this a phenomenon out in like the trendy world that I just have not been exposed to? Like, are squirrels a thing or do they know this about me? So it kind of freaked me out. And there's my fun fact.
Also, I'm like, is squirrel a cool hip thing that I also don't know about? Because I mean, that level of personalization.
Well, if the other cohort was getting emails about moose, then now you're getting somewhere. But that's probably a reference that the younger generation won't get. I don't know if anybody knew.
Did anybody else get the
Julie, I will
email?
follow up and we can, I can share an update with you in our next last call. Really keep people hanging.
Well, there you go. That's a good last call. That just shows the range we can have here.
Amazing.
All right. Mo, what about you? What's your last call?
Okay, I have been reading a book which Rachel Gearson recommended. It's called Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language by Amanda Montell. And I just, words are important, like you do. But when you go through this book and you hear about the evolution of certain words and how they refer to women, it just, I don't want to say delightful. It's been surprising in a really great way. Like, I feel like it's kind of added to me wanting to be more thoughtful about the word choices that I use, which is entertaining because I don't give too much thought to what comes out of my mouth. So anyway, go check it out. And Michael, over to you.
Nice.
Yeah. So mine is from back in May. James Hawkins, who's the CEO of PostHog, wrote an article about what he was thinking about as sort of their next chapter, a vision of the future. Just so if listeners aren't aware, PostHog is sort of both an analytics tool as well as other tools for digital and website operations. Anyway, I don't know that I agree with everything he wrote in terms of where products should go, but I thought it was very thought provoking and definitely worth some time because all of us in analytics and measurement spaces were facing a lot of change. And it's good to see okay, here's a company who's got a lot of customers, who's doing a lot of work, especially with AI. Here's how they're looking at the future. So I think it's kind of a good read just to develop and gain perspective. So that's why I would recommend that. All right. Once again, Jacob, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has actually been a really cool conversation and kind of we stayed pretty high, but I feel like there's also some really amazing kernels for people to pick up on and drill into their orgs with that I think will actually bear a lot of fruit. And also because it relates to songs so now in my head, I'm like, life is a highway. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. See, that's what happens to me when we talk about stuff. Anyways. So thank you again. And obviously to our listeners, yeah, I'm sure you've got thoughts and questions, and we'd love to hear from you. And there's a great way for you to do that. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn or on the Measure Slack chat group or via email at contact@analyticshour.io. And wherever you listen, you can also leave ratings and reviews, and we read all of those as well. And Tim Wilson, who's not here today, would like you to know you can also request a sticker for your laptop. Just go to analyticshour.io, and there's a form that you can fill out, and we will mail it to you, even internationally. All right. This has been great. I think there's about 3 more of these that probably need to be done. AI is changing so fast, but Jacob, thank you once again. And I know I speak for both my co-hosts, Mo and Julie, when I say, no matter where you are in the jungle, keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening. Let's keep the conversation going with your comments, suggestions, and questions on Twitter at @AnalyticsHour, on the web at analyticshour.io, our LinkedIn group, and the Measure Chat Slack group. Music for the podcast by Josh Crowhurst.
Those smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Do the analytics say go for it no matter who's going for it? So if you and I were on the field, the analytics say go for it. It's the stupidest, laziest, lamest thing I've ever heard for reasoning in competition.
I think actually, like, if you moved your cable around, I wonder if the cable was just like giving you some weird feedback or something. Because
Yeah, well,
Between my charging cord and my
don't
beer.
touch it
and my...
now. Don't touch it. Hands up.
Tim sent me a mic that he knew made a buzz. That was like an evil trick.
Sabotage.
Yeah, my toddler now uses it as her microphone, just, unplugged for fun. And I was like, sure, you can have this.
Does she do a podcast because you do one? Because that would be the most adorable thing in the entire world.
No, but she does like to sing.
Aww.
She just breathes into the mic.
So that's what I do.
I'm going to be triggered a lot with every time the S word is mentioned. Usual.
I do the exact same thing, Mo. I look over because a lot of times I leave crap on my chair back here. And so then I look, I'm like, oh, clear off
I
that chair
don't. My
before we
husband
start
gets dressed
recording.
in here in the morning and decides to leave whatever pants he didn't want to wear in the background.
Well,
Trust me, you don't want to see what you can't see behind this cover up. Okay.
all of the mess is my
I do
responsibility.
get asked
in this.
very frequently, though, why I have so many remotes on the wall behind me. And I'm like, it's a fair question. Well, there's another one that's missing,
Like,
so
we
it's
don't
normally
use 3 of
5.
them. I don't know.
You're just a very successful person, and if people can't deal with that, I'm afraid to do it. I'd be afraid of that level of success. Is what my answer would be.
5 remotes?
I know. I don't have the lifestyle governance required. All right, let's get into it. So I'll give us a 5 count. And all right, let's stop moving our microphones.
That's the problem with a YOLO one. It
Hands up,
flings.
everybody.
That's right. That's right. We're very serious.
Rock flag, and if you build it, who will maintain it?